Welcome back, everybody, to the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. Our last episode, we hosted the House Majority Whip, Tom Emmer, and it was a great episode. Thank you, everybody, for watching and enjoying all the insights he shared with us. I think it was a great conversation. We're back this time to go over where we stand in the election, what that means for Bitcoin, what are the policy issues coming up, what are the polls saying, and how do they compare to 2020? Also, Bitcoin spurring rural development in Texas, just as we've been saying. Now we have some actual evidence of that. There's a lot to dig into. Sam, where shall we begin? You want to talk about the horse race a little bit?
Yeah, so much has happened in the past couple of weeks. We've had really interesting revelations on the campaign trail. Turns out that Kamala Harris, of all people, is a proud gun owner. She owns a Glock, purportedly. We also now know that Tim Walz is friends with school shooters, according to what he said on the VP debate just last week. So, Brian, let's actually start there with a quick recap of the VP debate. It was a fascinating debate in how civil it was. I was surprised by the Midwestern charm of both men. They were actually agreeing with each other on a number of different occasions. And you saw sort of that Minnesota niceness come through with Tim Walz and that Ohio folksiness come through in JD Vance. But I think SNL, to their credit, actually covered one of the funniest parts of this debate. Dylan, do you actually mind playing the second media there? This was a great mashup, a great summary of what happened in that debate the other night.
Okay, he's out there. He's doing his thing, whatever that may be.
Come on, just relax. You know, you haven't had a night off in 3 months. Do you want to watch something less stressful like the Menendez Brothers show?
I don't know, Dougie. I kind of wish I had picked Josh right now.
Oh, Josh Shapiro?
No, Josh.
Look, Tim will be fine. It's not like he's going to say something crazy.
I've become friends with school shooters.
That's great. I've become friends with school shooters. Tim Gaffigan does a spot-on impression there of the potential vice president. So, Brian, what did you make of the debate? Going in, there was this narrative out there that JD candidate was from the party of weird and that Tim Walz was the normal guy, but then you had Tim Walz with big flubs like that one. So what did you make of the debate? Did JD Vance exceed your expectations? And do you think this will have any actual impact on the state of the race right now?
Yeah, it was very interesting. I think you know that it went pretty well for JD because it seems to have vanished from the consciousness of the mainstream media pretty well. He was very good in his presentation. JD was in his mannerisms and in humanizing himself, just being a normal, smart person. He tied everything back to the border and the economy and onshoring manufacturing and some of the core messages I think that you'd put under the America First category. He was very on message. Tim Walz, I think, was a bit deer in the headlights. He's been a congressman, he's been a governor, but he hasn't been on the stage at quite this level. Of course, neither has JD per se. He had his best-selling book, and he had a movie about him, and he's been a senator. But both of these guys had to rise to the occasion of meeting a national audience. And I think JD definitely rose to that. Tim Walz kind of floundered. He didn't have good explanations for some of his exaggerations. Some of his answers were somewhat incoherent. A couple of just minor missed opportunities, I would say, for JD Vance. One is when Tim Walz brought up this idea that Trump was going to try to jail his political opponents. I think Vance could have hit Walz pretty hard on that because the lawfare that the Democrats have been engaging in against Trump and Trump-affiliated people is pretty scary. I mean, the censorship issue is obviously critically important, so it was good that he brought that up. But this notion that a lot of what the Democratic Party accuses Trump of is things that they are doing themselves, and I think that was probably a bit of a minor missed opportunity there. Generally, though, I think JD comported himself extremely well. He was able to cut through the noise and the caricatures of him that have been put forth in the mainstream media, and I think that's a big win. Whether the VP debate makes a huge difference, I don't think this is a 2008-like election where Sarah Palin actually ended up sort of becoming the issue over John McCain. It was hard to run against John McCain, war hero, had been, a maverick and had a pretty good public persona. He had hosted SNL a number of times. He had, I think, a pretty good image in the mainstream. Of course, they attacked him like they attack every other Republican. But in that particular election, I think the mainstream media viewed Palin as the easier target. And so they really made her the focal point. Due to McCain's age, there was a very real possibility that Palin could become president. And so they really made that a center of that election. I don't think that's exactly where we are in this election, but to the extent people are concerned that Trump is an older candidate, I think JD Vance proved that he could rise to the occasion. I think people will have a very difficult time imagining Tim Walz in that seat behind the Resolute desk. I don't know. What other impressions did you have?
Yeah, my impression was that this was a huge night for JD Vance because it was the public's perception of JD Vance returning to the mean. So what do I mean by that? Over the past few months, ever since JD Vance was named the VP, he's been made out to be somebody he isn't. Somebody who, wears eyeliner, or I won't even mention the other memes they've tried to launch against JD Vance to try to portray him as just this fringe character who's very strange and misanthropic and antisocial in some ways. But in reality, we forget that from 2016 to really 2020, JD Vance was a darling of the American left. He was the Trump whisperer. He was someone who could explain Trump's ideas and the economic policies of the Trump administration to a progressive elite crowd. And then when JD Vance jumped into the political ring, everything changed. When he became Trump's VP, they turned on him on a dime and they made him out to be somebody he isn't. But the reality is that what we saw the other night, that's the real JD Vance. That's the JD Vance that, the liberal left was honest about since 2016 through 2020. And so I think what the American public saw is, the media puts forward this perception of JD Vance and it's completely inaccurate. And that was laid bare the other night. And so that's my sense of the debate. I do think it was net very positive for Trump. And like you said, Brian, I can't imagine Tim Walz behind the Resolute desk. I wholeheartedly disagree with his policies, but beyond that, he just doesn't seem to have the demeanor of a president. He doesn't have the sense of gravitas that comes typically with that office. And he was bug-eyed the whole time. And outside of the direct quote, I've become friends with school shooters, says the other direct quote of the night that I'll always remember is, I'm a knucklehead. A self-proclaimed knucklehead probably doesn't deserve to be in the Oval Office. It's not a great look for our country, not a great look for Minnesota either. That was my take on it generally.
Well, enough about our silly opinions. What did I liked the Frank Luntz focus group. I thought that was very telling. And I think you have a link or a clip to that.
Yeah, there we go. So in the focus group, after the debate, he pulled, it's a pretty good sample of just normal Americans from both parties, and 10-2, they said that JD Vance won this presidential debate. And you could see in the reaction from progressive punditry afterwards, they recognized it wasn't as bad as the Biden-Trump debate earlier in the summer, but they recognized that it wasn't very good for their side. So interestingly, this could have implications for the national race. In the week after this debate, Trump has experienced somewhat of a surge, at least in the betting markets. Let's pull up the poly market odds right now. So poly market, some would say, is more accurate than the polls because everyone who is putting money into this betting market, they have real skin in the game, right? And so there has been somewhat of a Trump bump. I won't even say somewhat, but a pretty significant bump for Trump after the debate and also after his Butler rally. So what do you make of this? Trump is doing really well in the betting markets, and I think we'll see if the betting markets will be vindicated in the next month if they really are more accurate than traditional polls. But it seems like Trump has a good deal of momentum right now. What do you think explains that? Do you think it's real? Do you think this will last? What's your outlook right now?
Well, a couple things. One is that voters are starting to really tune in. Early voting has started in a number of states. Generally speaking, it's sort of an adage, I think, in the political consultant class, but it has the benefit of being somewhat true. In the last, I'm going to say 4 to 8 weeks, around that 6-week mark or so, people really do start to tune in. Most voters are not living and breathing politics every day of the year, but they do care about voting for president, generally speaking. But they'll really start to tune in. You'll start to see cable news ratings go up. People want to have more regular updates daily, if not semi-daily, something like that. So oftentimes you do see a shift around this time in an election, and you start to see the trend that often will lead to the result of the election. So shifting in one direction or the other, I think, is not unexpected. The other point I would say is that some of the top issues are the economy and the border and inflation. In, for example, 2022, I think the abortion issue was very top of mind. Roe v. Wade had been overturned. It was a midterm election, and so you need sort of a wedge issue to really motivate a base, one or the other. It's not as high on the list this time. And so I think those top issues on which Trump has big polling advantages are the ones that are more top of mind for the voters. And so I think the timing combined with the issue set are leading to this edge for Trump now. Although, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, I think, but the overall polling so far is not yet showing any kind of lead for Trump. But I want to compare the polls from the last election with the polls from this election, which I think actually do suggest there's a pretty significant edge for Trump at this point. We'll see if they fixed their polls or not, or if this is just a different sort of set of voters who show up this time. But yeah, let me stop there so we can continue through our analyses.
Yeah, let's stay on that exact point though, because you're absolutely right. I think Democrats are comforting themselves right now because Kamala is doing decently well in some polls, both national polls and some battleground state polls as well. But we also forget that the pollsters were historically wrong in 2016 and historically wrong again in 2020. And so if you take that into consideration, Brian, as you've pointed out before, they could be historically wrong again. And if they are this time, could mean that Trump wins in a landslide. CNN, of all outlets, they started to pick up on this, and they actually illustrated what this will look like if the polls are just as wrong in 2024 as they are in 2020. Can you actually play that clip, Dylan?
Let's just say the polls were exactly right. What does that mean for the electoral map? Let's look at this. Kamala Harris getting 276 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 262, mostly on the basis of winning these Great Lake battleground states, despite the fact that Trump carries 3 of the 4 Sunbelt battleground states. But the bottom line is, Kate Baldwin and dear audience, this race is tight.
Now, in the realm of playing the hypotheticals.
Yes.
So let's do that.
Yeah.
If the polling is off, like it was in 2020, what would that do to the electoral map?
So look at Donald Trump's electoral vote total right now if the polls were 162. But let's say the polls are off like they were back in 2020. Look where he goes. He goes to 312. Why is that? Because the polls underestimated Donald Trump in 2020. So the bottom line is, instead of losing those Great Lake battleground states, he wins all. He obviously holds on North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, and he gains Nevada. So if the polls are as good as they were in 2020, despite the fact that at this particular hour, Donald Trump trails in enough states to give Kamala Harris the victory, if the polls are off like they were in 2020, Donald Trump would actually win the election.
Wow, there you go. So if the polls are 100% accurate, which they never are, never have been, it's a neck and neck election that Kamala barely ekes by. But if the polls are just as bad as they were in 2020, then Trump wins with 312 electoral votes. Brian, this is something I know you've been talking about for a while now. What's your take? Do you think that the polls will be just as bad as they were in 2020? What do you think happens going forward?
Well, I think a number of them potentially are, because some of them were just as bad in 2020 as they were in 2016. Just to take a little snapshot, I did sort of a spot check of several of these polls. Now, we think the most important state in this election is going to be Pennsylvania. One of the recent polls that came out is this Insider Advantage poll. So I looked at how did they do in 2020. Well, on October 16th, so it'd be a week from now in the election cycle, they had Biden up by 3.2% in Pennsylvania. The actual result was that Biden won by 1.2. So they were off by 2 points. If that pattern holds, now they now have Trump up by 2 points. That means he would actually win Pennsylvania by 4 outside the margin of error of polls, And that's a really decisive victory in a state like Pennsylvania. If you look at the state of Ohio, YouGov is an often cited survey. On October 4th, 2020, they had the state of Ohio tied at 47 for Biden and Trump. The actual result, Trump won the state by 8 points. Today, they have, or in their recent surveys, they have Trump winning the state of Ohio by 8. So either they corrected their poll, or you could actually win by 16 in the state of Ohio. And I don't think the national Democrats really believe that Harris has a chance of winning Ohio over Trump. Now, the Senate race is likely to be closer because the senator there has a number of crossover voters. But if Trump wins the state of Ohio by 16, it means Bernie Moreno is going to be elected to the Senate by an awful lot of votes. Another snapshot, let's look at the state of Wisconsin, one of those states that CNN was discussing just now. I looked at the New York Times Siena poll. In Wisconsin, at the end of October of 2020, they had Biden winning the state by 11 points. 11.
Wow.
The actual result, Biden won by 0.6. So a difference of 10.4%, more than triple the margin of error. Today, or in their recent surveys, they have Harris up in Wisconsin by about 2 points. So if the pattern holds, if they're just as wrong in 24 as they were in 20, that means Trump wins the state of Wisconsin by 8.4 points. If Trump is winning Wisconsin by 8 points, this is not going to be a close election. And just looking at the national popular vote, conventional wisdom is, Democrats run up the score in states like California, so they often win the national popular vote. Not that that really matters because it's all about the electoral college. But if Trump is within a point or two in the national vote, he probably wins the electoral college. So with that as a backdrop, and if he wins the popular vote, then it's probably a landslide in the electoral college. So let's look at Reuters Ipsos, another very frequently cited poll. Their national poll, October 2020, so right around the same time in the election cycle, they had Biden beating Trump by 12 points in a national poll. The actual result was a little over 4 points. So today, they have Harris up by about 2 points. So if they are just as wrong today as they were 4 years ago, that means Trump wins the popular vote by more than 5%. If Trump is winning a national popular vote by over 5%, this election is not close in the electoral college. That means he wins virtually every single swing state. So for that reason, now maybe one or two of these polls has course corrected. Maybe they're a little bit more accurate today. Maybe the abortion issue turns out more Democrats than we think. There's a lot of variables here, but if past is prologue, even though these polls currently show Harris with small leads, it means that, again, if we're taking our cues from how wrong they were last time, it means Trump has actually got a very good lead, and it potentially could be big enough, as he says, to be too big to rig. If you listen to consultants who talk about the margin of error being actually the margin of mistakes, or if or cheating, or whatever you want to say, the margin of any irregularities, say, it's very possible that we're there, that Trump is getting that swamp the vote, as he says, that he needs to win. Again, if the polls of 2020 are just as wrong in 24, it means Trump is actually up substantially in this race right now, heading into the final 4 weeks.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's other warning signs out there as well. One of them being Kamala Harris's media tour. Dylan, can you pull up the screenshot of Kamala Harris on Call Her Daddy? Your campaign is in a tough spot when you're putting the leading candidate on a sex podcast. This is, in my view, a red flag. This was a disastrous interview. I think the host herself regrets it because Republicans in her audience called her out and said this is clearly advocating for the Democratic candidate for president here. So that she was on Call Her Daddy, then she went on The View, then she went on 60 Minutes, and it was a train wreck. Even with highly selective editing, it's a really disastrous interview. And then she was on Stephen Colbert last night. He was fawning over her, and she still didn't have a good performance on any of these very friendly venues. On 2 occasions, she essentially said, there's no difference between me and Biden, and simultaneously said, I am the candidate of change. Those 2 things don't add up. So, Brian, I know within the Kamala Harris campaign, there was a real debate, especially during the month of August, as to whether they would allow her to go before the media or not, which is an insane prospect that the leading candidate for your party won't even talk to the American people. But it looks like the people within her campaign who were pro media interviews won out. But I don't know if that's been actually good for the Kamala Harris campaign. Do you think her doing this media tour right now is actually a sign of weakness, or do you think this is an innovative campaign strategy?
So if we look at I think one thing follows the other. So data point one, we just reviewed the polls. We don't know what the Harris campaign's internal polls are showing, but presumably they're showing that she's either leveled off or started to go down in their recent trends. So they needed to course correct. So they agreed to do the 60 minutes interview. Presumably there was staff in the room. She had an inclination of how it went. And so they needed to immediately drown that out. So first it was trying to fix the polling trend. Now it's damage control after a very embarrassing 60 Minutes interview. And so no more 60 Minutes, no more. It wasn't even that hard an interview, but compared to what she often does, it was, I guess, hard by comparison. They said, all right, no more fastballs. We're only going with slow pitch softballs here. So they went on these friendly outlets, and even they are not going very well. I mean, the clips coming out of these things are being immediately turned into ads for the Trump campaign. You mentioned the clip of her saying on The View that there's basically nothing that she would do differently from Biden. Biden said much the same thing from the podium over the last several days. By the way, he conflicted with one of her speeches. She was giving a speech and he came out to the White House podium at the same time. So right hand, left hand isn't even talking to each other. But she said there's basically no difference between my policies and Joe Biden's. And then Joe Biden from the podium said, well, she's been involved in every decision we've done. She's been a key player in all of it, basically saying there's no distance between the two of us. And even knowing that his poll numbers are bad and that, his performance is not looked upon favorably by the American people, so much so that he had to drop out of the race. I mean, this is a really confounding approach to me. But when you're losing, if we look at the counterfactual, let's say she was winning clearly by a lot, and you subscribe to the old adage, if your opponent is basically defeating himself, let him. That was the Biden strategy in 2020. It seemed to work. They didn't think that Trump was appealing to a lot of people, and he was doing multiple rallies every day. He was, potentially overexposed. So they decided to do the opposite and they thought they were in the lead. Therefore, all they had to do was not make mistakes. Well, today, obviously, they don't feel that way. And so they're behaving very, very differently from a tactical perspective in terms of putting her out in public. On a substantive perspective, it's not reassuring anybody. It's really not. And so that probably contributes to what we believe is momentum for Trump heading into the election. That combined with the Butler rally returning to the scene of the attempted assassination with Elon Musk and tens of thousands of people. It was a massive rally. I think that actually was a really, really advantageous press cycle for Trump. The momentum I think is swinging in his direction. And so the Harris campaign is sort of flailing to course correct, but every interview seems to be worse than the last. It's not going very well. And the Trump campaign, I mentioned they started clipping ads. That quote of her saying there's basically no difference between her and Joe Biden, they just clipped that section of her speaking and then said, I'm Donald Trump and I approve this message. If that doesn't show confidence, I don't really know what does.
Yeah, that's a solid rapid response team right there. It is, of course, it's October, and always we see the October surprise during this month. So the race is far from over, but it does seem like right now the Trump team is making the right moves, and Kamala is talking herself into a really tough spot right now. And like you said, Don't interrupt your enemy while he's talking himself to ruin. I think that's one of Sun Tzu's Art of War quotes or something like that. But it's a really fascinating race right now. A lot can change between now and then, but we'll see how many more podcasts Kamala Harris does with the hosts of people like Call Her Daddy. So a lot going on there. We've covered the horse race of politics extensively. Let's pivot back towards Bitcoin right now, because there's been a lot of really interesting Bitcoin news over the past couple of weeks as well. I think some of the biggest news is that we have had the first Democratic member of Congress endorse the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So that was none other than Representative Ro Khanna. Would you mind pulling up the article, Dylan? This is an article I wrote recently just covering this story where Ro Khanna, he's very tech forward. He represents the Bay Area. He's been very sympathetic towards crypto for a long time. He has been pretty pivotal within the Crypto for Harris organization in trying to get the Harris campaign to take a more dovish approach towards crypto and digital assets. And I think he's having some success. If nothing else, his endorsement of a strategic Bitcoin reserve is a good sign that this is a bipartisan issue. And so a lot of people were surprised to see a Democrat going on record endorsing this idea. Brian, I don't think you and I were, though. What do you make of this endorsement? Do you think that this is just the first of many more Democratic endorsements to come for this idea?
I do, because I think the idea is, like we've said, a political winner with virtually no downside, because Bitcoiners do see they see politicians like Ro Khanna out there being supportive, and they will be supportive in return. There are virtually no voters who see this idea and think, well, I'm not voting for somebody because they think this is a good idea. So I think the political calculus will lead to more endorsements like that. I think, as Senator Lummis has said, it's good for the U.S. government to diversify its balance sheet. Investments like this could help us with our positioning with regard to the national debt, which is spinning out of control. So we do need solutions. This is a possible solution, and politically, it's a winner. So I commend Congressman Khanna for his forward-thinking approach. I agree with him when he says things like, opposing Bitcoin is like opposing cell phones or laptops in the 90s. It is technology. It is advancing the way people do business, save their money, spend their money. It is sound money. It's something that I think, well, I just agree with him. I think opposing it is a political loser, and policy-wise, I think we need solutions, and Senator Lummis's idea that Ro Khanna has now at least sort of endorsed, I think that's great. We need more bipartisan, forward-thinking members. So great signal, and I think this sort of breaks the ice, as it were, for I think a lot of Democrats that may come on board in the future.
Yeah, and we applaud Representative Khanna for making this bold decision to endorse the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, especially because the strategic Bitcoin reserve can act more or less as an olive branch for Democrats who want to make peace with the crypto industry. Representative Khanna has been out front in trying to enact a crypto reset. There's this recognition amongst a lot of innovation-friendly Democrats that the Democratic Party has been extremely hostile towards crypto under the Biden administration. So there's a lot of bad blood there. There's a lot of bad feeling between leaders of the industry and leaders of the Democratic Party. But there's also a lot of really good legislators out there who want to return to form. They want to return to being a party that favors innovation, that favors big, bold technological ideas and progress. And Representative Khanna is foremost amongst them. And I think he intuits here that a great way to really accelerate the crypto reset is to support a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Why is that? Because Bitcoin, amongst all the cryptocurrencies that exist, is the least controversial of all. It is enshrined in law as a commodity. It's recognized by Wall Street as a asset that has real staying power, that, pretty soon we're going to probably find out that more pensions are buying the Bitcoin ETF, more wealthy individuals. Bitcoin's here to stay. End of story. And I think Democrats are starting to realize this more and more, and they want to make peace with the industry. The best way to show a change of tone, to show good faith going forward, is to support a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which is why, Brian, I agree with you. I think Democratic representatives will come around to this idea, and Representative Khanna will just be the first of many more to come. Really good news there on the Bitcoin and crypto front. We want to talk a little bit more about other exciting news with Bitcoin and crypto. One of them is the realization by different people around the industry and even outside the industry that Bitcoin is revitalizing rural towns. Just this last week, we saw an amazing op-ed from Mayor Ward Rodham. Mayor Rodham is the mayor of Rockdale, Texas, where Riot, the company we work for, actually has one of their biggest Bitcoin mines. And Mayor Rodham has been a Rockdale resident for decades. And he talks in this op-ed about how Bitcoin mining completely changed the fortunes of the town that he grew up in. Do you mind pulling up that clip? Thanks, Dylan. So yeah, Bitcoin mining revived my rural community of Rockdale. This was published in the Austin American-Statesman. We know that legislators and policymakers, they read this paper on a regular basis. And Brian, you know Mayor Rodham personally. I also know that you've talked with lots of policymakers around the state about the good that Bitcoin is doing in rural communities. Can you unpack this for us a little bit more and help explain for our audience so they understand why Bitcoin is changing the fortunes of rural America?
Yeah, it's a really, really important story because this specific example. You had a manufacturing town. There was an aluminum smelting plant that was there for decades, and that supplied a lot of the jobs to the town. It supplied the tax revenue that was supporting the schools and the police force and everything else you need to run a town. And fortunes changed in the market, in the regulatory environment. The plant closed down, and you saw hundreds of jobs and like half the tax base of this community disappear. Well, nowadays, if you have a lot of power infrastructure to run a big business like that, and you're in a rural area, there's a pretty specific business that is going to be able to function there. And Bitcoin mining really is the quintessential one because they need cheap power. A lot of businesses need to be close to an urban environment because, for example, data centers need customers. They need hospitals or banks or larger corporate headquarters, people running cloud computing operations or websites or other things. Think of some of the great American companies like Amazon or Microsoft or Facebook. Some of these need to be more closer to population centers. Bitcoin mining is looking for the cheapest power, and they seem to thrive with rural workforces who can help operate an industrial scale business. Today, unfortunately, we're making fewer things in America. We're manufacturing fewer things, but we've started to make Bitcoin in America. And so with that, you've seen companies go into rural communities where they can get the cheapest electricity on a grid that allows them to be flexible. They have a workforce that's there that was prepared from their prior experience. They can be reskilled, retooled, retrained, and given new opportunities to work in a cutting edge industry. And it's sort of a match made in heaven. So the employment base is coming back to Rockdale. The tax base is coming back to the community. And it's because the circumstances are pretty much perfect for Bitcoin mining. So it's a critically important point that policymakers need to understand. If you have rural areas with a big power supply, you should welcome Bitcoin miners into your community because they can monetize that power. They can create jobs. They can restore your tax base. And this use case, this scenario that Mayor Rodham describes is really a story that I think more people need to hear because it's going to make a lot of people's lives better. It's already happening in Rockdale, and it can happen in other communities as well. He even brought up the Corsicana site, which is going to be the biggest Bitcoin mine, I believe, in the world. It's another community. It's not quite as small as Rockdale, but it's also pretty rural, and it's going to help revitalize that town. He was sort of encouraging his counterparts in other towns, open your mind to this. It's going to make your town, your community stronger. So really grateful to the mayor for putting his thoughts out there. It's never easy to do that, to speak publicly, but he shared his honest experience. And I think that's going to really help policymakers see the value in this industry going forward. So really, really great op-ed. Really glad to see it.
Yeah. And it was courageous of Mayor Rodham to put himself forward like that. And that's a story that needs to be told. And I think we're going to hear more stories like that come out in the near future, because if Bitcoin's shown anything, it's a tool for economic empowerment. Doesn't matter if you're from urban America or rural America, it's there to help people find jobs, be able to save in a instrument that actually preserves their savings as opposed to just keeping your savings in the US dollar. So great story there. So Brian, we're just about out of time, and we always end on our grab bag section. I have some thoughts for grab bag this week. Did you have anything you wanted to share?
Well, maybe we can talk about this in a future episode, but I did watch the HBO documentary on Satoshi called Money Electric. It's about Bitcoin. And I kind of want to collect some more thoughts from the Bitcoiner community, and we can have a more fulsome discussion on that. But why don't you do your grab bag items? Because I think they're funny.
Yeah. All right. So my grab bag this week is about the country over party. So I don't know if you guys heard, our country ended recently or is about to end. And who's celebrating it? The Kamala Harris campaign. Can you pull up that clip? Okay. So this was an event that Kamala Harris did with Liz Cheney, who we all know is formerly a Republican, one of the foremost neocon war hawks in the party. And she has so courageously left the Republican Party to celebrate Kamala Harris, putting in their view the country over the party. But the way that Kamala's campaigners set this up, it looks like they're celebrating the country over party. And it is just a hilarious coincidence. And I'm so surprised this got past the political communication staff. Brian, you and I have worked in political comms during our career, and I've never seen a mistake of this magnitude. I think it's hilarious. It reminds me actually of a satirical ad that was placed in Britain a few years ago. So I think this was put forward by the Progressive Party in the UK, kind of mocking the Conservatives. They say, we plan to cut all homeless people in half by 2025. So grammar is incredibly important. You have to always think of any double entendre that might accompany your political messages. And what's funny is that with that spoof in the UK, that was a deliberate satirization of what the Conservatives were saying. But with the Kamala campaign, no satirization there. The country over party, I'm bummed I missed it. If the country's going to come to an end, I hope they were able to send it out with a bang. But anyways, that's my grab bag for this week. And Brian, I know we're coming up on time, but I just wanted to end on that note. Any other thoughts before we close out here?
Oh, great news about Bitcoin this week. Really interesting developments in the presidential race. Obviously, we'll be laser focused on this, especially Bitcoiners will be, since President Trump has come out saying he will be a pro-Bitcoin president. So really interesting stuff. Good discussion this week. Reach out to us, hit that like and subscribe button, follow us on X at MorganSternNJ, and we will see you next time on the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod.